It is said that the sea can be both a friend and a foe. Some find in its endless waves a path to fortune. Others meet their ruin there. But for one woman, the waters of the South China Sea became the foundation of a reign so vast and unlikely that it would pass into legend. Her name was Ching Shih, and she began life far from the image of a fearsome pirate queen. We do not know the exact year she was born. It was sometime in the late 18th century, perhaps around 1775 or 1780, in the province of Guangdong. Her early life was unremarkable, at least in the way history records such things. She was a girl in a fishing village, part of a family for whom the ocean was both livelihood and danger. The boats brought fish to market, and sometimes storms brought men to their deaths. The world she knew was one of tides, trade, and uncertainty, but she had sharp eyes and a sharper mind. By the time she was a young woman, she had found work in the floating brothels that served the sailors, merchants, and pirates who passed through the region. These brothels were not fixed buildings but ships, moored in harbors or drifting near busy routes. It was here that Ching Shih first came into contact with the dangerous, lucrative world of piracy. Among her customers were smugglers, black market traders, and men who commanded crews of hundreds. She listened more than she spoke. She learned how power moved across the sea, how wealth could be taken as easily as it could be earned. It was in this world that she met Zhang Yi, a notorious pirate leader from a family with a long history of seafaring crime. He commanded the Red Flag Fleet, one of several pirate factions that operated along the coast. He was ambitious, restless to unite the pirate crews into something greater. And he saw in Ching Shih not only beauty, but intelligence and influence. She had connections in the ports, a reputation among sailors, and a keen understanding of negotiation. In 1801, Zhang Yi asked her to marry him. Accounts vary on whether this was a romantic choice, a strategic alliance, or both. But she agreed on one condition: she would share in the command of his fleet. This was extraordinary. Pirates might take wives, but they rarely ceded them any power. Zhang Yi, however, consented. From the start of their marriage, Ching Shih was not merely a wife, but a partner in leadership. Together, they began consolidating the scattered pirate bands into a confederation. Through diplomacy, bribery, and calculated threats, they brought smaller crews under their command. By 1804, the Red Flag Fleet had grown into a vast coalition of ships, numbering in the hundreds. They controlled the seas from the Vietnamese coast to the Pearl River Delta. Merchant vessels paid them tribute for safe passage. Villages and ports negotiated for peace. Ching Shih's influence grew steadily. She was known for her discipline and cunning. She managed the fleet's finances, enforced codes of conduct, and even arranged marriages. The sea had been her world for nearly a decade. Every sound, every smell, every change in the wind had once been a signal to her, a whisper from the ocean about what was coming. But now, in the year 1810, the rhythm of Ching Shih's life changed. The pounding of waves on a ship's hull was replaced by the muted shuffle of footsteps on packed earth. The salt air of the South China Sea gave way to the warm, smoky scent of the city. She had stepped ashore not as a prisoner, but as a victor. The surrender she had negotiated was unprecedented. Her men had been pardoned, her fortune untouched, her name unshackled from the charges that had hung over it. The officials who greeted her were courteous, if a little wary. It was clear they respected her cunning even as they hoped never to face it again. Chung Patsai, now her husband, took his place in the Imperial Navy. He wore the uniform with an ease that made Ching Shih quietly proud. Once a boy who had risen from obscurity to command ships under her flag, he now sailed under the banner of the Qing dynasty, hunting the very kind of men they had once led. Yet the bond between them did not falter. They had been allies in war. Now they were partners in peace. Ching Shih herself turned to business on land. Guangzhou, bustling and full of opportunity, became her new domain. She purchased a gambling house near the heart of the city. It was a place of low ceilings and warm lantern light, where the clink of coins and the rustle of playing cards filled the air until late at night. The wooden tables were worn smooth by years of hands resting on them, hands that held fortunes or lost them in an evening. The patrons were a mix of locals and foreigners. Sailors from distant ports stopped in for a game before heading back to sea. Merchants tested their luck after a day in the market. And every so often, a face from her past appeared. An old crewman, now living quietly on shore, or a captain who had once flown her red flag. They would nod to her across the room, an unspoken acknowledgement of what they had shared. In those moments, she felt the echo of the waves again. But the world was changing. Trade routes shifted. Foreign powers pressed deeper into Chinese waters. Steamships began to appear, their churning paddles cutting through the sea faster than the wind could carry a junk's sails. The balance of together, they began consolidating the scattered pirate bands into a confederation. Through diplomacy, bribery, and calculated threats, they brought smaller crews under their command. By 1804, the Red Flag Fleet had grown into a vast coalition of ships, numbering in the hundreds. They controlled the seas from the Vietnamese coast to the Pearl River Delta. Merchant vessels paid them tribute for safe passage. Villages and ports negotiated for peace. Ching Shih's influence grew steadily. She was known for her discipline and cunning. She managed the fleet's finances, enforced codes of conduct, and even arranged marriages. The news of her passing moved quietly through Guangzhou. No banners marked the event, no public mourning was ordered, and no proclamations were read in the market squares. She had long since stepped away from the sea, living out her final years in the stillness of a city that had once only been a stopping point between voyages. Yet, for those who had known her name in other times and in other places, the knowledge that she was gone carried a weight that was hard to measure. The gambling house she had built remained open in those first weeks. The lamps still lit in the evening, the sound of dice and coins still echoing through the rooms. Patrons came and went as they always had, though a faint unease seemed to hang in the air, as if the walls themselves understood that something was missing. The woman whose gaze had once been enough to silence an argument or settle a dispute now sat nowhere in the corner, and the absence of her quiet authority was impossible to ignore. In the city's narrow lanes, the people who had known her personally kept their thoughts to themselves. She had never been one for loud displays, and even in death, there was a sense that silence suited her. The harbor outside continued its daily rhythm, ships arriving heavy with goods, others leaving light on the tide, fishermen repairing nets on the shore, and the calls of porters ringing against the wharf walls. Life did not stop for any one person, no matter how formidable they had been in life. But in the smaller, dimly lit corners of Guangzhou, there were places where her name still carried a certain power. In tea houses tucked away from the main streets, in small gambling rooms where the air was thick with tobacco smoke, in the back corners of warehouses where sailors gathered to drink, there were murmurs about her. Some spoke of the woman she had been in the city, a shrewd businesswoman who could not be cheated, a figure whose mere presence demanded respect. Others, usually men who had seen the sea in their younger days, spoke of her as she had been before that, the commander of a vast fleet, the pirate queen of the South China Sea. The men who had once served under her were older now, their hair graying or gone, their hands marked by years of labor on land. Most had long since abandoned the life they had led at sea. The Qing Navy's strength had grown, and foreign ships, armed with weapons the likes of which few had seen before, patrolled waters where once her red flag had flown without challenge. The world that had allowed her to rise to such power no longer existed. Yet the stories persisted. Her name traveled beyond the city, carried by traders, sailors, and merchants to ports far away. In Macau, Singapore, and Manila, one could find men willing to speak of her, though the details often shifted with the telling. In some versions, she was a ruthless warlord, feared by all who crossed her path. In others, she was a master strategist, a leader who held together the Moes. The years after her passing moved like the tide, slow in the moment, swift when looking back. In Guangzhou, life pressed on. Markets bustled. Ships arrived and departed. Taxes were collected. And the daily rhythms of trade smoothed over the memory of an age when the red flags of pirates had once flown here in the open. But there were still those who remembered. A boy might hear her name not in the classroom, but whispered in the kitchen at night. A fisherman's wife might tell her daughter the story of the woman who ruled the waves, not to frighten her, but to show her that even the sea had once bowed to someone of their kind. The truth was never told the same way twice. For some, she had been ruthless, a terror to all who crossed her path. For others, she had been clever and just punishing only those who defied her laws. Every telling carved her a little differently, like a statue shaped by many hands. Foreigners were often the most eager tellers of her story. They came with notebooks and questions, drawn by the irresistible combination of piracy, rebellion, and mystery. British officers in Hong Kong wrote of her in measured but fascinated tones, cataloging her fleet's size with numbers that swelled each time they were retold. French traders in Macau preferred the romantic version, the courtesan who became a queen of the seas, commanding thousands of men through charm and cunning. Some of these tales traveled even farther, across oceans to Europe and America, where newspapers printed her name alongside other notorious pirates, though rarely with the truth intact. By the late 19th century, steam had replaced sail on most major trade routes. The old wooden war junks, once so feared, now looked quaint against the dark hulls of foreign gunboats. Piracy still existed, of course, but it was scattered, desperate. Small bands of men striking quickly and vanishing into the maze of islands. No one again matched the scale of Ching Shih's confederation. The seas she had ruled now belonged to empires, In some parts of Guangdong, it was said that the last of her lieutenants died quietly in the 1880s. One man, a bent and toothless figure in his 90s, was found in a small fishing village, living in a hut barely big enough for a bed and a stove. When asked if he had known the pirate queen, he only smiled faintly and said, "We all knew her. Even if we never met her, we knew her." Then he would say nothing more. Meanwhile, the world beyond China shifted in ways that would have been unthinkable during her lifetime. Western merchants flooded into treaty ports, the Qing court struggled to maintain control, and the South China Sea became a busy corridor for international trade. But even as modernity pushed forward, there were pockets of the coast where the past clung on. In those quiet harbors, the old songs were still sung. Not loudly, but enough that a child might remember a melody, even if they didn't know the words. At the turn of the century, chins. The evening fog clung low to the cobblestone streets, the scent of coal smoke and brine lingering in the air. In a dimly lit tavern near the docks of London, the creak of old timbers mixed with the quiet murmur of voices. Tankards clinked, a log shifted in the hearth, and a group of sailors leaned close over a battered oak table. Their eyes gleamed in the firelight as they spoke of faraway waters, of ports thick with the smell of salt and spices, and of a woman whose name carried on the wind across oceans, Ching Shih, the pirate queen of the South China Sea. To hear them tell it, she commanded a fleet of 1,000 ships, each bristling with cannon and crewed by men who would follow her into the very jaws of death. They spoke of red sails unfurled under a blazing eastern sun, of her standing at the bow in flowing silks, her eyes sharp as a drawn blade. Some swore she could vanish into a storm, reappearing in another harbor before the winds themselves knew she had passed. Others claimed she had treasures enough to ransom a king, hidden away in secret coves guarded by spirits and sea serpents. No one in the tavern knew how much was truth and how much had grown in the telling. Sailors' tales had a way of stretching with each retelling, shaped as much by longing and drink as by memory. Yet the name Ching Shih had weight. It lingered in the air long after the story was done, as if the woman herself might walk in from the fog at any moment. Across the decades, her legend traveled farther than any ship she had ever commanded. In Paris, her story appeared in the pages of travel journals, each line gilded with flourishes to please readers hungry for the exotic. In New York, penny novels painted her as a dark enchantress, a queen of thieves who lured men to their doom. Some tales placed her in distant battles she had never fought. Others invented romances with European officers she had never met. The truth was no match for the appetite of the imagination. On stages lit by gas lamps, actresses draped in shimmering fabrics played her role, striking heroic poses before painted backdrops of stormy seas. The audience applauded, carried away by the drama, never knowing the real woman had walked away from piracy to live her last years quietly on shore. In the flicker of stage light, she became a symbol, a mask worn by many, a dangerous beauty, a ruthless commander, a ghost of the China seas. And still the years rolled on. By the early 20th century, her name had slipped from the public ear, replaced by newer stories, newer wars. The seas she had once ruled now churned under the keels of steamships flying foreign flags. Empires rose and fell, and the memory of the pirate queen lay buried in the dust of archives and the yellowing pages of forgotten books. It was not until the latter half of the century that her story began to surface again. In quiet university libraries, historians paging through old Qing records found the outlines of her life. The tree, the harbor never truly slept. Even in the darkest hours before dawn, there were always sounds: the soft lap of waves against wooden hulls, the groan of ropes stretching under the weight of the tide, the occasional muffled call of a night fisherman as he checked his nets. From her upper room, Ching Shih could hear them all. These were not the battle cries of her youth, nor the shouts of men steering ships into the teeth of a storm. They were gentler now, the heartbeat of a port that had learned to breathe without fear. She had lived here long enough that the rhythms of the place had woven themselves into her own days. The mornings began with the faint haze of cooking smoke drifting through the narrow streets. Vendors called out in voices still rough from sleep, their words carrying the promise of fresh catch and hot rice. She would sit by her window at this hour, watching the streets come alive. The tea would be strong, the air still cool, and her gaze would follow the first boats heading out toward the open sea. Sometimes she would wonder what it would feel like to step aboard again, to feel the pitch and roll under her feet, to hear the wind in the rigging. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. That life was not hers anymore, and she had no desire to reclaim it. She had lived enough for 3 lifetimes. Now, she was content to watch others take to the water, each chasing their own horizon. The harbor itself was changing in ways she could not ignore. The old junks still came and went, their sails patched with cloth in every shade of brown and tan. But alongside them now were sleek steamships that moved without the pull of wind. Their tall funnels poured smoke into the sky, leaving dark trails that lingered over the water. The men aboard them were not only Chinese. She saw faces from far-off lands, men speaking in tongues she did not understand. They brought with them goods she had never seen before, fabrics with strange patterns, bottles of drink that caught the light like liquid gold, tools made of steel that glinted even in the weak winter sun. The locals adapted quickly. New shops opened along the waterfront, selling foreign trinkets alongside the familiar baskets of dried fish and bundles of bamboo. Even the gambling houses began to attract a different sort of crowd. Merchants from distant cities, sailors who had never heard her name, men who had no idea they were sitting just a few paces from a woman who had once commanded more ships than any emperor. Ching Shih watched them come and go, always quiet, always unnoticed. That suited her well enough. Yet there were moments, fleeting but sharp, when her past brushed up against her present. One afternoon, a young sailor stumbled into the gambling house with a pocketful of coins and a story spilling from his mouth. He claimed to have heard of a pirate queen who had ruled the South China Sea, a woman who had made the emperor's bow and the merchants weep. His companions laughed and sh. The smell of the harbor had changed over the years. Once, it had been all salt and tar and the sharp bite of fish left too long in the sun. Now, as the morning light filtered through the paper screens of her small upstairs room, there was a faint undercurrent of coal smoke drifting in from the docks. Somewhere, beyond the jumble of rooftops, the funnels of foreign steamships rose above the masts of the old junks, their black smoke curling lazily into the pale sky. She sat at her table, the lacquered surface worn smooth with years of teacups and the weight of her resting hands. In front of her, a small pot of chrysanthemum tea sent thin tendrils of steam into the air. She cupped her hands around the porcelain, feeling its warmth seep into her fingers. Outside, the street was waking. A fishmonger's cart rattled over the cobblestones. A child called out for someone to wait. The clipped rhythm of sandals on stone told her that the market had already opened. Her world had become smaller over the decades. The room, the tea shop below, the narrow street that led to the harbor, and the steady procession of days. But her mind could still cross oceans in an instant. It took only a sound, a creak of wood in the night, a gull's cry, the slap of water against stone, for her to find herself again on the deck of a ship, the wind tugging at her sleeves, the sails full and white against the sun. Those who still recognized her were fewer each year. An old fisherman might nod when they passed, his eyes lingering a fraction too long before he looked away. A tea shop regular might tell a visiting cousin, in a voice just low enough not to carry, that the old woman upstairs had once commanded more ships than the emperor's own navy. But for the most part she was left alone. That suited her. The harbor had been her world, and she still visited it often, walking slowly along the wharf, leaning on the smooth handle of her cane. The ships were different now. Bigger, heavier, louder. Their smoke blotted the sun. Their metal hulls clanged when struck. But in the quiet hours, when the tide was high and the light was soft, there were moments when the harbor looked as it had in her youth. Then she would pause, letting her eyes rest on the water, the ropes, the worn wooden planks beneath her feet, and the endless horizon beyond. Sometimes she was approached by younger sailors, curious but respectful. They had heard pieces of the old stories, the vast red flag fleet, the daring raids, the treaties that bent emperors and governors alike. She would smile faintly, shake her head, and say nothing. The truth belonged to her, and the truth was too large, too heavy to give away for free. One afternoon, as the air hung heavy with summer heat, she sat at her window watching the market below. The stalls were bright with fruits and fish, their colors vivid in the sun. A foreign merchant passed by, tall and pale, his coat a deep blue trimmed with gold. He paused to speak to the mist came in low over Canton that morning, curling between the wooden buildings like a slow breath. It was the kind of fog that muffled footsteps and softened every shape until it seemed the whole city had been dipped in a pale watercolor. From her window, Ching Shih could not see the far side of the harbor. Only the nearest masts, ghostly and still, broke the whiteness. She moved carefully, cane in hand, her steps making almost no sound on the polished wooden floor. The house was quiet except for the faint creak of the beams as the river tide shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a single boatman called out, his voice a muffled echo, swallowed by the mist. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the table by the window. The porcelain cup was already cooling, the faint floral scent of chrysanthemum drifting up to meet her. She had made it herself before dawn, more out of habit than need. In her youth, mornings had been filled with voices, men calling orders, the slap of rope against wood, the whistle of the wind across the deck. Now the only sound was her own breathing, slow and even, the rhythm of an old tide that had learned to keep its own pace. The harbor had changed so much since her time. Junks still floated at the piers, but there were more steamships now, their tall funnels like blackened towers against the sky. The British, the Portuguese, and others had taken their share of the river's space. She remembered when the waters belonged to her and hers alone, when a single red-sailed junk appearing over the horizon could make whole towns hold their breath. A knock came at the door, soft, hesitant. She turned slowly, leaning her weight onto the cane, and crossed the narrow room. The wood was cool under her hand as she slid the door open. It was the old fisherman she saw sometimes in the market. His hair was as white as the sea foam, his face folded into 100 lines from years in the sun. In his hands he carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Morning, Lady Ching," he said quietly, bowing his head just slightly. "Caught these before the fog came in. Thought you might like them." She accepted the bundle, 2 small fish, silver and still glistening. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but warm. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he replied. His eyes, still sharp despite his age, lingered on her face for a moment, as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the tales he'd once heard. "They still talk about you, you know, out there." He nodded toward the harbor. She gave a faint smile. "They talk about a name," she said. "Not about me." When he left, she stood for a moment in the doorway, watching his figure disappear into the whiteness. The fog seemed to close around him as if he'd never been there at all. She spent the rest of the morning sitting by the window, the fish cleaned and set aside for later. The market sounds were muted, as though the world itself had slowed down to match her pace. She could almost imagine. The morning was soft with mist, the kind that blurs the edges of rooftops and makes the harbor seem like a painting half-finished. In the small wooden room that had been her refuge for so many years, Ching Shih sat by the window with a pot of tea. The steam curled upward in thin white ribbons, carrying the faint scent of chrysanthemum. She moved slowly now. Her hands, once quick enough to knot a sail in the dark, trembled slightly as she lifted the cup. Age had been creeping in for years, but she had learned to treat it as an old acquaintance rather than a thief. The aches in her joints, the way her eyes tired easily in the evening, these were simply the price of a life lived long. Beyond her window the harbor stirred. The cries of gulls cut through the damp air, and the muffled shouts of fishermen loading baskets echoed off the water. Steamships, hulking and dark, loomed alongside the older junks. She could smell coal smoke and salt and thought, for just a moment, how strange it was that the world kept moving long after the people who had ruled it were gone. She had been many things: a wife, a widow, a commander of the largest pirate fleet the world had ever seen, and later, a quiet figure in a city that no longer feared her. Few knew who she had been. The children who ran past her door saw only an old woman with a cane. Yet, every so often someone would pause, an old sailor with weathered hands, a fisherman with a look of recognition in his eyes, and they would nod to her in silence. That was enough. The day passed in its usual rhythm. She walked slowly to the tea shop near the market, leaning on her cane. The street was busy but not rushed. Merchants called out prices. Women bargained for fish, and the smell of roasted chestnuts hung in the air. She greeted the shopkeeper, who always poured her tea without asking what she wanted. She had been coming here for years, always taking the corner seat by the window where she could watch the harbor through a narrow gap between buildings. Sometimes, she thought of the fleet, hundreds of red sails stretching across the horizon, the way the wind filled them like the breath of a god. She remembered the feeling of the deck under her feet, the snap of banners overhead, the quiet nod of men awaiting her command. The sea had been both her kingdom and her gamble. It had taken her husband, her youth, and many who had trusted her. But it had given her more power than most could imagine. In the evening, she returned home as lanterns began to glow along the narrow streets. The air was cooler now, the mist lifting to reveal the far edge of the city. She stopped at the harbor's edge, the boards of the pier creaking under her weight. The water rippled softly in the dark, reflecting the orange glow of lanterns swaying in the breeze. She closed her eyes and listened, not to the city, but to the sound beneath it, the one she could always hear if she tried, the endless rhythm of the sea. That night, the